Good morning, everyone. Good to see you today on this session of a priest and rabbi walk into a classroom. Yesterday, Aaron has gone even higher in my esteem. He took me to a wonderful car museum with 16 classic cars, and I got to spend 2 hours doing that. And by the way, it's his birthday. Maybe we can sing to him later. Happy birthday. Would you pray, please?
Thank you. I'm of the belief that everyone should have a birthday at least once a year. So I had mine on Friday. Thank you. Just like we practiced. Thank you. We'll begin with the traditional Jewish blessing over study. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech ha'olam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed is the source of life, who has sanctified us with commandments and enjoined us to engage with texts of meaning. Okay?
Jessica. Ask Jessica to read the first part today.
He put before them another parable. Can you hear me? Hello? Is that better? Like this?
Pretend you're in a big room full of lots of people
Like
who
this?
don't hear like they're 12 years old.
Hello? I don't know if I can. Well, I'll shout over it.
Yep.
He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in the field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds amongst the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The slaves said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he replied, No, for in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time, I will tell the reapers, Collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn.
Don't you want to say the word of the Lord, thanks be to God, after that? Thank you. Jesus was a terrible farmer. I think we can all agree to that if you read these parables, but he was an excellent storyteller and theologian. Now, this parable, we listened to the Matthew version. The first week, we listened to a Lucan version, but they occur right in a row. These two parables about seeds. You remember the first one? Sower went out, cast seed on the path and on the rocky ground and among thorns and on the good soil. And then there's an explanation. This story follows immediately afterwards. And let me ask you again, what is the kingdom of God? What is the kingdom of heaven? All these parables are about different aspects of the same thing. So there are commonalities as well as nuances, slight differences among them. So always keep that in mind. The kingdom of God is like a sower who went out. And this one, usually called the parable of the weeds, the kingdom of God is like, compared to be someone who sowed good seed in his field. What do all these parables do? How do they operate? Have you figured that out yet? They're stories about agriculture, a simple thing to move to a complex thing. They're about agriculture or merchant stuff or baking, but they're also about the way God's realm, God's vision for restored creation, the Messianic age, operates and is in the world. So all these, again, are different aspects of that. The main job of a parable is to point us to God, to point us towards the kingdom. I've said 1,000,000 times, the main job of a priest is to point us to God. Here's a little fun historical fact. In most images you'll see around here of the Blessed Virgin Mary, if there's Jesus there, she's doing this. Can you all see me? What is this doing? Pointing to Jesus. It's not about me, it's about God. The parables do that. Jesus points us to God in the kingdom. You could also say that's what the main job of a Christian is, what God is doing in the world or through the people. And so we'll look at 3 parables in a row, and they all start with a small thing, a tiny thing, and moving to a big one. So a man sowed, notice it's a man, this one later it's a woman. A man sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and then went away. Do you recognize what Jesus just did, what he introduced in this very simple but also clever line? Where in the world, what do weeds represent in this? You got good seed as the kingdom and the bad seed. Evil. So in this brilliant little piece, he introduced the concept of evil. Where does evil, what is evil? The opposite of good, it's fake. In this story, evil is a counterfeit. It's a poor facsimile of the real thing. It kind of looks like it, but it's not the full reality. It's simply a bad representation of it. And so the seed is sown all over, and this other bad seed, which is a great expression, he's a bad seed, grows up right alongside of that. And so the farmers, I do a lot of gardening. If you're a good gardener, that's why I said Jesus is a bad gardener. What do you do as soon as you see a weed in your garden? Pull it. Why do you pull it? It's going to choke out the good stuff. It'll suck up the nutrients in water. It blocks the sun. It has lots of negative effects. And God forbid you let it grow and flower, and it dumps all the seeds of weeds everywhere. And as it turns out, weeds tend to grow faster and bigger than all the good stuff you want, and chokes it out. So always, you said? So the farmers, the ones who actually have to work in the field, are really concerned about this. And they go to the farmer and say, Master, did you not sow good seed in the field? Where do the weeds come from? Where does evil come from? And the response, where does evil come from, according to the story, is what? The enemy. Let's get him. Who's responsible? But what does the master, God, say to do? Not what I want him to do, by the way. Who doesn't want evil punished, injustice righted, go after the bad guys, teaching the lesson? Maybe at the end they get to burn in hell, so there's a potential good there. What do you want us to go up and gather them? No, from gathering the seed you uproot the wheat along with them. If you don't get those weeds very early, you may as well let them grow. I do, again, all sorts of, particularly hydroponic gardening. If you've got 2 little shoots coming out together and you pull one, chances are better than not you're going to rip out the good right along with it. So let it be, he says. And the slaves don't like that. What is this seed that's grown everywhere? Where does it go? The good seed. Where does the good seed go? In this story, the good seed goes everywhere. That's a very important point to recognize, that all of them follow the same pattern. The good seed doesn't go in one spot. The kingdom is everywhere, spreading all the time. It's still active no matter what. Later on, Jesus allegorizes this parable, which, quite frankly, I think is extremely lame, and it misses the point. And he does it because the disciples, as one author calls them, the disciples are professional point missers. They miss the point of what he's saying all the time and can't seem to get it. So he allegorizes it for them, which is, as I say, quite boring.
Well, let me just add one comment or two comments to that, and that is that the parables, it strikes me, are about things that are incredibly ordinary and otherwise familiar, right? So even in the losing something simple, planting seeds and weeds growing up, it would have been familiar to everybody in the same way as these metaphors work for us, right? We may or may not be gardeners or know anything about actually planting a harvest and sowing and the rest, but we can appreciate that these are everyday, ordinary images that, in this case, Jesus is using, it strikes me, to invite us to see something ordinary and to see beyond it or to see deeper within it, right? And so what I would invite us to consider with regard to the good seed and the bad seed is not to imagine ourselves as the gardener watching this happen and having to decide what to pull up or what to let grow and the rest, but rather to imagine that here we live within this garden, the world as it is, where there's good, there's evil, there's temptation, there's encouragement, there are all kinds of things, right, as we make our way through a day, as we make our way through a life. And the question is, how do we discern what is good or what is evil, or who is good or who is evil, and how we should go about living our lives such that we bring about, in this case, manifesting the kingdom or realizing it. Is that fair? Mm-hmm. Right? So as we speak about these parables, I want to invite you from time to time to see yourself in the parable, perhaps as one of the elements, a protagonist, a character, part of the metaphor, and to recognize when we're outside the parable, sort of reading it as a detached reader, as opposed to seeing where we are in the midst of it. It strikes me as I've been sharing this class with you, if we are to understand, as we're encouraged to do, that all of these parables bespeak the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, that in some ways they're both a descriptor and also, if you will, a guide or a map that we can use to figure out if this map works for you, terrific. And if this situation, the other parable, is a better fit for the circumstance that you're in, that we're in, that wisdom from that parable or that metaphor works better, then that's the one we use. Does that make sense? That would be how, I mean, the idea that good seed and bad seed, that there's good and bad, that's rather prosaic. But the idea of how we discern one from another, or how we determine, or how we ourselves respond when we're not sure as we encounter a given situation or a given individual, or reflect on our circumstance, what it is that we should be doing, how do we remain, pun intended, how do we remain faithful to what's expected of us?
Aaron, we talked briefly about this. Where within Judaism, how does evil come into the world, or how is that understood?
Right, so the problem with evil, among other problems with evil, is where does it come from, or what is it? And is it also created by God, or is it a result of an enemy, Satan, the devil, whatever else? It is a secondary force. And in the first century, the Jewish community was very concerned about the idea of dualism, that God would have been the creator of good, and there would be another force that would fight with this God that would be responsible for creating evil. And so we tend to square it by suggesting that evil is the absence of good. Someone said that before, much like dark is the absence of light, that idea. More consonant, however, is the idea that in Judaism, that while there are things that are abject evil, most things in and of themselves have the propensity to be either good or evil. Was it not Shakespeare who said, it's neither good nor evil, not good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. So money, the sex drive, our bodies, are they in and of themselves good or bad? Well, it depends how we use them, to what end we're pursuing them. The rabbis in the Talmud speak about the fact that if no one had any ambition, if no one was desirous of improving themselves, then no one would open a business, right? That no one, and on the other hand, if you're only about the pursuit of money, well, then something's out of balance, and that's probably not to a good end. Similarly, we can go off in all kinds of depraved ways, and yet if we didn't have a sex drive, we wouldn't make families. And so in and of itself, it's not good or evil, a given item or a given occasion or person. Just like no one individual is all good or all bad in any given moment or lifetime. And so evil is that which we contend with as we discern what we're going to make of the world around us.
So you notice, thank you, why I ask that is how Jesus fits within that. Let it be, good nor bad. The word, by the way, let it be, in Greek also means allow, permit. It could also mean forgive. To let it be, to forgive it, and God will deal with it later. The next parable, and you notice there's a long first one we read the first week, and then this larger one about weeds, and all these rapid fire things. Maybe this occurred over a longer period of time, but people remembered all these different ideas. So if you ask, the disciples asked the question, so what is this kingdom thing you keep talking about? Here's rapid fire, all these examples. I have noticed, I'm sure Aaron has noticed this, sometimes people will come out and say, oh, good sermon, what did you like about it? And it's not something I actually said at all. It was a completely different idea. Or, oh, I really liked that sermon, what did you like about it? This aspect, which, and then somebody else will say something totally different. Because we all connect with different stories in different ways. And so Jesus tells, I think, lots of parables about the same thing, partly to gain different aspects of it, but also, from a different angle, if you will, but also because that connects or resonates more deeply with some people than others. And notice this is a device. He put before them another parable. Okay, that example. How about this example? The kingdom of heaven. Why does it say heaven instead of God? Matthew uses kingdom of heaven. Mark and Luke say kingdom of God, same thing. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds. Not really, but let's just say it is. But when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nest in its branches. That one's nicer, don't you think? Birds and a tree grows and it's pretty. What in the world is this one about? Faith? Now, very good point, Tom. Parables can have a straight allegorical meaning, like Jesus gives at the end, the interpretation, but at their best, they're multivalent, polyvalent. They have multiple levels of meaning. And part of it depends, and Aaron has said this before, it's when you read it, what you're going through, what's the context. So partly this could be about faith. It's definitely about the kingdom of God. It can speak to you in many ways at various points in your life. This little seed becomes a huge bush. So like the first example, the kingdom grows. Like the leaven later, it grows, it expands, and goes all over the place. Little detail you may not notice. In the very first parable, the first week, what were the birds representing, the ones that came and ate up the seed? They were bad. In this case, the birds, there are a few examples within the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible that talk about Israel is this great tree, and birds from all nations come to dwell or shelter among its branches. So it's a sense of Israel is the covenant people, and Gentiles, that is everybody not Jewish, come and nest there. They make their home, they abide, they dwell in, they take shelter in. And so Jesus is using that image from the Bible that everybody would have like, oh yeah, I remember something about that. And applying it, that's what the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, is like. It opens the kingdom, opens the chosenness, the covenant people, to Gentiles too. No reaction. That's crazy, you're wrong, that's sinful, that's apostasy, whatever. There's this example. So the kingdom of heaven, really small, grows and welcomes everybody in. There's a sense of, who knows what the word Catholic means? It means small c. Capital C is Roman Catholic. Small c means universal, everybody. And so this is Catholic in that sense. It's everybody is welcome into that. And he told them another parable. Like, oh, geez, I barely digested that one. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. So the first story, God is a sower, a man going out. And look how God is portrayed here. A woman baking. That's a fascinating image. How much does she make? 3 measures. Anybody know how much 3 measures is? She made her husband a sandwich. Is that what's going on? 3 measures, so you put the flour with the water, it's 100 pounds of yeast, of dough, 100 pounds of dough. That is a lot for anybody doing that. I also worked when I was in seminary. Long story short, it used to be $2 for the young people. It used to be $2 a minute to call long distance to Russia. I worked in a bakery. Every hour I worked, I could talk to Natalie 3 minutes. It was awesome. And so as I worked kneading bread, and I was like, how many loaves do I have to knead to talk to her for 10 seconds? You start doing the math in your head. Because there's not a lot, it's meditative, but it's not a lot of fun, and it hurts your hands after a while. But imagine this woman making 100 pounds of dough by herself, presumably, rolling this out, kneading it, on and on and on. This is, again, trees that welcome all the birds. The whole field, the whole world is this big lump of dough that Jesus is making. And imagine, if you would, God as this woman kneading the dough, creating it, breathing on it, loving it as she's doing that. Aaron, you and I talked yesterday about the yeast.
Right. So I'm fascinated about how when these parables come in 3s, as it were. So there's a series, but the third one invariably includes a bit of a twist. So if you remember, we were talking about the lost sheep, the lost coin, and then the prodigal son. We said sheep go off on their own, coins fall out of your pocket, but a human being, when they leave, has agency, and now we're dealing with something a bit more complex. In this case, we have the metaphor of the kingdom being among the weeds or in the garden. The next one is about mustard seeds and something small growing into something big. In this case, the idea of the leaven and the dough, we often may think of the leaven being outside the dough, but my sense of what's being described here is a dough that can't be separated from leaven, and where you could, if you were discerning, distinguish weeds from wheat, and if you were determined, you could, I suppose, pick up all the seeds that have been scattered in a field, as difficult as that might be, needles and haystacks and the rest. Physically, it's possible, right, to go back and retrieve those seeds. Once leaven is inside, once yeast is mixed into dough, it can't be extracted. And so now we have a metaphor wherein the dough itself, that now is comprised of both the flour and the water, and now as well as this yeast component, which my understanding is something a little bit more close to a sourdough starter kind of thing, as opposed to individual packets of yeast. Now we have something that can't be pulled apart. And now we have a world, we're looking for the kingdom in this, right? Now we have a world in which the kingdom is within this metaphor of leavened dough. And I think it's an incredibly rich metaphor that we could do a lot with. I'll stop there and take a breath if you want to jump in.
Oh, good segue. Did you do that on purpose? Thank you. Very nice. What effect does yeast have on dough? Makes it rise. Do you know how? Creates bubbles. It's carbon dioxide. Thousands of little pockets of carbon dioxide is what the yeast creates. And when that's heated, you bake it, it causes that to expand. So air within the dough is what causes it to expand. I don't think that Jesus intended that, but imagine the air, the breath going in. What is ruach?
Spirit, breath.
Ruach in Hebrew is spirit or breath. How did God create the world, all of creation? Speaking it. So the air, the breath of God goes out. How did Adam give life? Out of dust, God breathed life into them. So there's a sense of divine breath going into this to giving it life. And that's also, again, I don't know if Jesus meant that, but it'd be really cool to me if he did. The two are, again, indistinguishable. And so this wheat and weeds growing together, and then the yeast within that, the kingdom, and again, every single one of these is about the kingdom. Some similarities, some nuances. Jeffrey?
Just a little detail, it only takes a little bit of yeast to leaven a lot of bread.
It only takes a little bit of yeast to leaven a lot of bread.
So if you have 12 disciples, it only takes a little bit, a small group.
It only takes a little bit, a small group. This sounds like a rock song from the 60s. We will get to disciples in just a moment. Notice after this great brief parable, Jesus told the crowds all these things in parables. Without a parable, he told them nothing. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. See if anybody is a really deep Bible scholar and recognizes this. I will open my mouth to speak in parables. I will proclaim what has been hidden from the foundation of the world. Anybody know? He's quoting the Bible, what we would call, again, the Old Testament, from Psalm 78, and it is the first couple lines of Psalm 78, and 78 is about God's salvation. He's the one who knows better than I do. It's about God's salvation history. So calling the people of Israel, they're in bondage and slavery in Egypt. God sends plagues and delivers them, and as they're going to the promised land, so they escape slavery, they get bread rained down from heaven, and what do the people do to Moses and Aaron? Oh my God, I'm so sick of this bread. It's the same bread every day. It's awful, it's boring. And they grumble and gripe the whole way there, but still God calls his holy people. It's all, the whole psalm, which is called, the psalm writer is called the prophet in here, is about God's salvation history, God's ultimate plan to restore all of creation. And so this is a very subtle and clever way. It's not so subtle if you're Jewish and had this deeply in your head, that he's citing this, echoing Psalm 78, is that's why I talk in parables, because that's what I'm fulfilling the scriptures. This is what I'm supposed to do as a Jew.
Can I add a bit about leaven? It's also, I think, important to appreciate that while we can now read these parables and do anything we want with them, right? So we know something, and you know more than you thought you knew, or more than you did when you walked in, about the fermentation process within yeast and dough. It involves carbon dioxide, and we can understand that to be what we expel when we breathe, and therefore breath of life, and maybe Jesus knew that, and maybe he didn't. We can do all of that, but what we should appreciate or pause to understand is what leaven represented metaphorically in context, right? It's an odd agent, yeast, right? It's a strange kind of thing. It does something that we depend upon, and yet it's rather inexplicable, at least in those cases back then. And so what did leaven represent? Do you have a sense of that? Anyone know that? If you know the Jewish tradition at Passover of getting rid of all the leavened products in one's home, in order that for the week of the celebration of Passover, we remembered that the Hebrew slaves, when they were leaving Egypt, didn't have time to let the bread rise, and they were on a hurry, and so we have matzah. The removal of leavened products from a Jewish home in preparation for Passover has long been metaphorized. Is that the right verb? Has long been understood that that which is leavened, or that which puffs us up, can be understood as arrogance, can be understood of those qualities of personality that are the least attractive that we possess, the ways in which we move among people in a way that doesn't represent us well. Leaven in the ancient world was often understood to be a metaphor or a symbol for moral corruption, for that which takes us away from the original character of something. It can be used in a positive way or in a negative way. More often than not, it was used in this case to describe that which was undesirable, or that which you would rid yourself of if you had the opportunity as leaven. So, the idea that we would use leaven in this, or that Jesus would use leaven in this parable to suggest that leaven is exactly what is necessary to bring about the kingdom, or that which is leaven is inseparable from the dough of the world, if you will. The world is a leavened what's the units of flour?
Three
measures, thank you. That the world is these 3 measures of flour, but don't make a mistake, it's 3 leavens of flour that has the leaven, the yeast, baked in. Not quite yet, but that's what's going to happen. We should also imagine, one could imagine in any case, that for the Jewish community, those persons who now were beginning to follow Jesus, or now were identifying with these parables or following the path towards the kingdom as Jesus is describing it, may have been understood in their own community or among their own people as those who are leaven, if you will, those who have strayed a bit, or those who aren't towing the path or the line. And in that context, now we understand the leaven to suggest that the world depends upon those persons who are the early Christians. Does that make sense? That which you thought in these counterintuitive ways that the parables build on themselves, that which you thought was undesirable is necessary, right? The meek shall inherit the earth. The first shall be last. The small make something big. That which is unseen is actually what we're working towards. These are counterintuitive ideas. If we understand the leaven, which is necessary to bring about the kingdom, being those persons, that is to say, all of us are required to bring that about. We're no longer the detached baker or actor who puts the dough together and then just puts it in the oven the way that, remember, I think it was Reverend Wilberforce in the 1800s who described God as a watchmaker, or suggested that if the world is to God the way a watch is to a watchmaker, then we would understand that a watchmaker who makes a watch fashions the instrument and then puts it on the shelf. And the watchmaker isn't involved in the watch any longer. And if that's the way we understand, Reverend Wilberforce will suggest this in arguing with Charles Darwin, if we understand in a similar way that the world is independent from God, then we'll misunderstand what that relationship is. God's not the watchmaker who, having created the world, now sits back and does other things in retirement. But rather, we're involved in the world constantly, and so is God, and it's all of this peace, and I think that's what I want to suggest.
Yeah, God's a tinkerer.
Right.
Doesn't
Involved.
sit back. You had a point, Clint?
Yeah, the yeast parable was said in the very tiny notes at the bottom of the parables, said it came from Isaiah.
They say in the yeast parable came from Isaiah. Almost
In general, all the parables, that's why Jesus speaks in parables.
So, good point. So much of what Jesus' parables he's giving have echoes in the Hebrew Bible. A good point. To whom is Jesus telling these parables? Jewish people. Some are his disciples, his close group, the followers, and some are larger crowds, and some might even be Pharisees or scribes. But at this point, everybody is Jewish. Later, when things are written down, non-Jews, that is Gentiles, Greeks, Romans, everybody else, starts to encounter them. And so they miss some of the context of the story, but a lot of this is rooted within his Judaism. Small fun fact, did you make the connection of why do we have these little flat pieces of wood that we eat for communion? It's unleavened bread. That's the point. That's why we do that. I don't mind real bread, but let's see. The interpretation of the weeds I mentioned briefly before. I feel that this is probably the author of the gospel explaining it for people. Rather than letting the story stand on its own and be, again, multiple meanings, multivalent, He has to simplify for the hearers. In this case, it's the disciples who ask. I cannot tell you how frustrated Jesus must have been, because this is, the crowds who show up once in a while is one thing, but those who follow him every day, every moment for several years can't make the most basic connection or point as his disciples. So here you go. Aaron and I, when we were car ride back yesterday, I mentioned something. These are the disciples he's telling this explanation to. What's the difference between a disciple and an apostle?
The disciple believes in someone who's still alive, and after Jesus dies, the apostles are those who continue his ministry.
Kind of. They continue Jesus' ministry. Disciple means what? A student, a learner, a disciple of this great teacher. What does apostle mean? Sent. One who is sent. Apostle, you could also translate it as ambassador. So they act not on their own accord, but on behalf of someone else. God, Jesus in this example. Are they different groups of people? It's the same people, basically. Disciples are learners of Jesus, and then at a certain point they are sent by Jesus out into the world to do what? Tell cool stories, make some money, have a career, make your parents proud of you. No, it's to carry on the same thing that Jesus did, to continue his ministry, to share the good news, to preach the kingdom, so to continue exactly what he'd been doing. So disciple, and do we ever stop being disciples if you're an apostle too? Hopefully no. You keep practicing. Something, Alan Lewis doesn't like when I say this, but I love to go listen to Alan practice at 7 a.m. on Sunday morning or 6 o'clock on Sunday morning or all throughout the week. Alan is very, very good. He could just skate by, but he practices by himself over and over. You hear him working on a phrase, and he's been doing this virtually his whole life. But to be precise, to get it right, he keeps practicing over and over. You're always a learner. You're always a disciple, even when you're the apostle, the one who is sent. So I think Jesus is frustrated that his great star students still don't seem to get it. Allison? She said the disciples are always sort of doofuses. That's not in the Bible, but it's true, yes?
They're very useful, and because they weren't learned people, Jesus has to explain this, so we get an explanation now.
Because the disciples were not learned people, they were by and large fishermen, working people for the most part. There are extra explanations, so that helps all of us.
If I can?
Yeah.
I've been playing with this idea since Jonathon introduced it to me, that the disciples and the apostles are the same individuals. It's just a matter of who they are in that moment, or the level of their own development, or what it is that they're doing with that which they have determined is worth being a disciple about, right? That is to say, for a while we're a student as we go along, and then eventually you're expected to take what you've learned and do something in the world with it, right? That's the idea. My thought is, in this case, if we think of ourselves as the leaven, those who have enormous potential, but until that potential is engaged, the potential doesn't mean a whole lot, right? We like to see a young person who shows promise, but we'll wait to see if in time that promise is in fact fulfilled. In this way, it occurs to me that discipleship, or being a student or a follower, is all well and good, and you may describe yourself as, I'm a student of, or I subscribe to this school of thought. Okay, all well and good, so you can take on that label because you identify with those teachings. All well and good. But what you do with that is of consequence. And what I suggest, the turn of phrase that I have coined and I like, is that what you believe Take a disciple. Or here you are, individuals of faith. You've chosen to be here on this morning in order to deepen your understanding of your respective faith traditions, that what you believe is interesting. And as Jonathan and I were talking, we're interested in what people believe, and that makes for interesting conversation. I'm interested in you, and your beliefs are interesting. But that's about as far as it goes. What your beliefs compel you to do, or what you do because of what you believe, that's of significance. Which is why ultimately we're not trying to convince each other or convince anyone here what you ought believe, or to convert anyone to believe as anyone else does. What we believe is interesting, and it makes for really good dialogue and all kinds of creative thinking. But what our beliefs encourage us do, moving from discipleship to apostleship, being the leaven in the world, being the agent for change, or working to bring about the kingdom, the world you want, the world as it could be, that's the charge, it seems to me, that is drawn from these wisdom traditions.
Russ?
Unfortunately, Jesus doesn't leave us in any doubt about that point that you were making, Rabbi. You read forward to chapter 25. Now it's not plants and weeds, it's sheep and goats. The apostles are saying, well, what do we need to do to get into the right group? And he says, take care of the poor. So it's an ethic of care. It's not just how the world is, it's what you're called
Let me
to do.
say this for Russ is strengthening the rabbi's point. That's right, it's how we live into this kingdom. He's skipping ahead to the end, the best part. Matthew 25 is, by the way, what I had read as the gospel for my institution as rector. How does God think of us? It's putting our faith into action. How do we live into the kingdom? How do we love God and serve and love God and our neighbors? Are all various ways of saying the same thing that we've talked about at least the last 9 years. Now, there's a little bit of distance. We got seeds and dough and some other stuff. Later become sheep and goats that are separated by their behavior. And what is that? How do you tell a sheep from a goat in the Bible in Matthew 25? When, Lord, did we see you hungry or thirsty or naked or in prison, and so on? When did we act like the kingdom is real? That's how we put it into practice, how we inhabit it, how we dwell, abide in the kingdom, is living it out. And now Jesus is setting everybody up. Helpfully, Russ gave us the punchline at the end. Then do this thing. Don't put a sign up in your yard that says, I'm a sheep, and whatever that means at the particular moment. I'm the good seed that fell on good ground, good soil. Look how righteous I am. No, just go do that. That's the point Jesus makes over and over. What else did you want to say?
The other strong hint in the middle of this parable that runs through Matthew, especially the Sermon on the Mount, is the ethic of nonviolence.
Ethic of nonviolence.
Don't go after the weeds, because if you do, you're going to do more harm than good.
If you go after the weeds, you'll do more harm than good. What we said a little bit earlier, Aaron did, is no one is pure evil, no one is pure good. Is anyone here pure good? Allison? Charles is pure good, according to Allison. No one in here is pure evil. It's very hard to separate out in the world, let alone even in our own lives. And that's part of I think the let it be, not live and let live, but let it be for now, because if you try to rip it apart, you're not going to do the kingdom or yourself or the world any good, even if it feels like you're doing something.
And it occurs to me also, and I heard something on the NPR pledge drive yesterday that I want to share with you because it strikes me as connected. See if I've got this right, Jonathan. That between I'm thinking of the parable of the weeds and the parable of the yeast in the dough. There's a sense that the kingdom is there all along. You may be distracted by the weeds, or you may be frustrated by the weeds, or tempted by whatever it is. They're an obstacle of some sort. They're an impediment, it seems, at least having the garden that you desire. But in that garden, the kingdom is in there, And the guidance that we're provided is, wait it out. In time, you'll be able to distinguish one from the other, and that will be the time to extract the weeds, or that will be the time to make determinations as to what's a good growth and what's not, which is what makes Jesus a bad farmer, you're saying, right? Because that's not the way you would go about it. Similarly, the yeast, yeast in dough, it strikes me that the yeast in dough is the metaphor for the world in which we live, and that the kingdom is within that there's no part of the dough that isn't leavened. It's riddled throughout. There's no part of the world or our experience that is absent the presence of God or the potential of this starter that will make for the kingdom. It's all baked in there, right? So it matters. What do you do when you bake bread? At a certain point, you put it in the oven, and then you just wait. That's all you can do. And similarly, when you're gardening, if the goal is to wait till the weeds grow to a certain height before pulling out, all you can do is wait. Your frustrations notwithstanding, your eagerness notwithstanding, whatever, the kingdom is coming to be, and our job is to wait alongside that, to patiently bide our time, to do what's expected of us, and then we'll discover what is there. The connection to the NPR pledge drive was that Ira Glass is encouraging you to make your contribution now. It'll be doubled by to generous benefactors. But he says, I'm now going to say the quiet part out loud. If you don't pledge, we'll still be here. We're still going to be here. We're going to broadcast. We're going to do the shows that you like, whether or not you pledge. The kingdom is going to be here whether or not you're cognizant of it. Whether or not you do anything to bring it about. Ira Glass then says, however, in spite of the fact that we'll be here whether or not you pledge, you should pledge. Because you have a responsibility, because you have an opportunity, because you have an obligation, because that's what's expected of you, and that's how we make the world better, and that's how we realize what we're able to create together. So I think that's an interesting piece, that it's not about what we do to create the kingdom, but rather, to my perspective, it's about recognizing it amidst the weeds, or recognizing it within the recipe. What am I doing?
No, that's very good. You maybe think of something I have never considered before, particularly the parable of the weeds. What are the field workers focused on? The weeds. They're mad about the weeds, not at all the good that's already there. How much, I can tell you, if I heard, maybe it's just me, 100 positive things and one negative thing on a Sunday, what am I likely to remember? Is it the same with you? That negative bias sticks out in our head. Is it helpful to focus on all the weeds? Not really. You're not going to do anything about it, but to focus on the good, the kingdom that's there, to recognize it, to not to call it out, but to point to it for everybody else that's there. These last three brief parables, kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. Notice it doesn't say buried, it says hidden. It's not under the ground. Somewhere out there, the guy sells all he has, buys the whole field. It's, again, symbolic of everywhere the treasure is all over it. The kingdom is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. The guy knows what he's looking for. This is his area. He finds it, sells all he has, and buys it. The last one is the most Catholic of all of them. Nets thrown into the sea. What is this type of fishing? It's not fly fishing. It's a dragnet, meaning it catches every single thing that's there, including, by the way, unclean fish. This kingdom sweeps up all the good Jews, the less good Jews, the really good, the perfect, the pure evil, but it also pulls up everybody else within that. It's a message that the kingdom belongs, or a better way to say that, the kingdom doesn't belong to everyone. Everyone belongs to the kingdom. That's a more precise way to put that. Did you see the pattern over and over in all of this? Is it just for one group of people? No. Do you have to do anything to make it happen? Not really. Seeds grow on their own. What's the point? Multiple points Jesus keeps saying over and over, that the disciples, the dullards that they are, never seem to get?
Fire away. Okay. Two thoughts I'll try to pull quickly together. The first is that I had a professor who suggested that sometimes we have to see what's in front of us, but we have to recognize it. Wait for a moment, right? We have to recognize, but to recognize is to recognize what's right in front of us, which is sort of a fascinating way of imagining our need to re-see or reimagine, or to put it in a different kind of, we see the weeds, but we fail to appreciate what's really going on there, or we imagine what we see is X or Y or Z, but we should appreciate it differently. Another way of saying it is that you were very gracious that all of you enjoyed, such as it was, October 21st, but for you it was just Friday. For me it was my birthday, right? There's a great line in the movie Rocky, when Rocky goes to pick up Adrian for their first date, and he knocks on the door, and Paulie, her brother, who's going to be his manager, opens it. Behind him, over you can see, in this row house in South Philly, a table festooned with Thanksgiving fare. And he says, Rocky, what are you doing here? He says, I'm here to pick up Adrian for a date. He says, a date? It's Thanksgiving. And Rocky says, to you it's Thanksgiving, but to me it's Thursday. Right? If you don't have someone to celebrate the occasion with, if you don't have the opportunity to imagine something, that today is someone's birthday, and that's a wonderful thing, as opposed to it simply being another day. If you fail to appreciate what's going on in the dough, or what's happening in the garden, or what's right in front of us, you may miss the entire story. That's what I take from these parables.
Are you 40 yet?
54.
54. Happy birthday.
And 2 days.
Any last questions? Do you mind singing happy birthday to Aaron? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Aaron. Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Thank you all.